I'm not gonna lie, I have not been looking forward to this episode. Hey, it's Romania Black. We're on episode 36 of Monster. We're at the halfway point of the series, right? Right, nearly the halfway point. I think next episode will technically be the halfway point, but this feels like a midway checkpoint because we've gotten to the part where Tinma is very close to killing Johan. And I'm dreading this episode, if I'm being fully honest. I am dreading it. Because I just, no matter what happens, I don't think Johan's gonna die. I don't think he's gonna die. Him and Tinma are the central characters. I don't think he's gonna die. But the fact that Lunge is getting the Munich police together, the fact that Nina's there, that Dieter's told Reichwein not to let Tinma become a killer, and Reichwein's going to the scene of the murder. That could be the fact that this damn book's getting involved now. Finally, it's all coming together, and I just grabbed my bag of Werthers to have at the ready beside me in case I needed them, because I'm a little freaked out about this episode. I'm not gonna lie. And so, yeah, but I do have some comments to get through before we start. I'm terrified, y'all. I'm just trying to, it's okay, Romania, it'll be all right. But let's go through these comments, and I got a few things to talk about before we start. I'm going to stall to the last minute. But Sunray had a really awesome comment talking about Hesse's work that was mentioned a few episodes back, that Hermann Hesse's work, Steppenwolf, was about a man's spiritual journey towards self-acknowledgement, which is, we're having lots of talk about names, about identities, about self-acknowledgement, finding our place in the world, all that fun stuff. But also, the other work was called Demian. And in that work, it is also about self-actualization and is inspired by Carl Jung, which I remember in grad school reading works by Carl Jung. So that when I saw that name, I was like, oh my God, I've read Carl Jung stuff before for grad school. So I was like, oh, that's cool. Bringing him back up again, who proposed the soul could be broken down into 4 parts: into the persona, what others see about you, which we've had a lot happen in this story, the shadow, which is the unconscious part that can surface on occasions. Sounds like Johan, right? And then the anima or animus, the behavior characteristic of your opposite sex, which to me reflects on Nina because it's Johan's twin sister. And whereas Johan feels like creepy and menacing, Nina seems harmless and innocent. So that seems like that opposite, right? And then the ego, which is the consciousness part of you that knows it exists and understands your identity. So the ego understands who you are and what you are, right? It's kind of like part of that self-actualization. And this is called Map of the Soul. And the story, Demian, centers around a sheltered boy that crosses from good to evil over the course of adolescence to adulthood. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can look at that. You can look at Johan crossing literally from Prague and Czech Republic over into Germany and crossing that good to evil threshold. Then you could connect it to the Johan's childhood ending and his adolescence leading into adulthood to create who he is. You could also look at Tinma's adolescence, where he was so bright-eyed and innocent. Now in adulthood, he's discovered things are not as rosy and sunshine and rainbows as he thought. You can connect it to Dieter, and hopefully Dieter doesn't cross over from good to evil. You can connect it in a lot of different ways, right? But I thought that was really fascinating, and I have a feeling that the idea of those 4 parts, the persona, the shadow, the animus, and the ego, we're probably going to be using Whiteboard Coon to talk about at some point, so just keeping all that in the back of my head right now. But I was like, Carl Jung, I've read his work before, so that was a lot of fun. Also, EQ had a couple really cool comments talking about how in the episode 33 specifically, there's a big thing about height differences. So you see the way that Dieter is positioned lower than the adults trying to talk to him about what he should do. You see Martin sitting in the bed lower than the adults standing over them. Then they go on top of the roof where they're above the entire town. And then you have the idea of Johan having to bring people to the top of things to get to his viewpoint, the idea of the woods. The idea of height's very interesting. There's also a really cool commentary about the EQ brought up about the book preservation, and we'll talk about that. The idea that the books, which were described by the librarian as the preservation of humanity, the legacy of humanity being preserved in this airtight, sterile environment that's not accessible. The idea, it's kind of like we talk about the Garden of Good and Evil, not necessarily the very symbolic thing of the Garden of Eden, but it's kind of one of those things where the forbidden knowledge is right there in front of humanity. The knowledge, the secrets to the world are right there in front of humanity, but they're locked away in this little airtight, sterile environment, right? Whereas you have the children's book that we assume is about the monster, it's out there in the open for anybody to read, out in this warm environment, decaying and rotting and slowly smudging the hands of anybody that touches it. So there's this very interesting distinction about the texts that are preserved in this sterile, clean environment that humanity never touches, and that's the legacy of humanity, versus the Book of Monsters that everybody can get their hands on, and that's like grimy and like just dirty and everything. It's fascinating, so fascinating. But speaking of fascinating, I told you all in the last episode that I was thinking about ordering Volume 4. Yeah, I did. I did. I found out that the last episode is where Volume 4 ends. So I'm caught up now with the manga. This manga volume is probably my favorite so far. I really like Volume 4. It is packed. One thing that is interesting is that on the cover is Nina up here. I'm assuming this is Nina down here. What's fascinating is little Nina is holding a book. Nina is holding the Book of Monsters. And it says like Kabluda or Gadulda? I can't read it. I don't want to read it. I don't want to be spoiled because I'm sure they're going to tell us the name at some point. But you can kind of see the book here. I'm assuming this is Nina holding the Book of Monsters. And so that made me think, like, is Nina tied to a memory with the book that Johann remembers? And he's like, oh God, freaking out about it. There are some notable things in this volume. This is literally nearly a beat for beat adaptation, which is really exciting. There's not a whole lot of extra in this book. I do want to note one thing. The damn building. I talked about the building with Richard. Like this Volume 4 starts out with the segment around Richard. They focus on that damn building throughout the segment here and point out how creepy it is. I'm like, is there a reason behind that? Because they keep focusing on that damn building. It's pretty scary. Also, whenever Richard sees Johann or Hess, the boy that he shoots, the close-up on his face is terrifying. There's some really scary imagery in this volume that I was like, oh God, I'm not ready for that. One thing that I kind of went back as I was reading and was noticing within the volume are a couple of things, right? There is one distinction that's changed from the manga to anime that I do want to note. But the distinction here too is Johann often looks very melancholy throughout this volume. And I noticed that in the anime, he smiles a lot. But then there are moments like when Tenma's watching him through the television screen and it focuses in on him. He's not smiling or looking devilish. He just kind of looks bored and like, why am I here sort of scenario, which is fascinating. But also another thing that's really interesting with this volume, I do love the color pages. The color pages are so wonderfully done. They're like Copic. They're Copic markers and you can tell. And I'm like, oh, that's great. One thing that's really, really interesting in this edition is Richard goes to talk to the one guy that was the CEO executive alongside Schubert. And he talks about how Schubert and this one guy that ends up getting killed had been rivals. And they, like, one guy would declare bankruptcy and he would cause Schubert to declare bankruptcy and they go back and forth. And Richard was like, oh, so they were rivals, right? And the man goes, yes, they were rivals, but really they were friends. And Richard's kind of like, friends? Like, he doesn't seem to understand it. And in that moment, I was like, oh, so this is kind of like Tenma and Johann. So does Johann consider Tenma his friend when he's his rival? I'm like, I don't think Tenma considers him that at all, right? I don't think that's the same thing. Also, the chapter 55, Journey to Johann, where the little boy is talking about becoming like an evil empire leader. We talked about this last couple reactions about Johann's complacency. Yeah, the kids are like, oh, messing up everything sounds fun. I don't want to be a rainbow warrior anymore. I want to be in the evil empire too. And he just sits there and watches. And I'm like, I want to feel somewhat bad for you, Johann, but then when these kids talk about starting evil empires, you don't say a damn thing. So maybe you should. And then I'd feel a little bit more empathy to you. But I don't think Johann wants my empathy, right? I think Johann is just observing humanity, but I'm like, observing's one thing, but you exist. You should do something. Although he tells the Red Hindenburg he does not exist, so maybe he doesn't believe he has any presence in this world. He's just causing things to happen. Yeah, the whole thing with Jurgens stabbing himself in the face is terrifying. The stuff with Lunge is interesting. The one thing, though, On top of the building, the thing that the anime changed, because I was waiting for it when I read the manga adaptation, they show the confrontation of Richard, where Johann calls him out for shooting the boy, but not being drunk, right? And there is never the moment where Johann has the smile. The smile's in the anime. Smile is not in here. It's just him giving him the bottle. And that's it. But there's no... It really makes you think that Richard, shot the boy without him actually being drunk, and he was just trying to use it to, alleviate his own guilt. But still, y'all, I still maintain everything I've said about Johann up to this point, but this was really fascinating to look through this. And then whenever Gillen is talking about the criminal... Let me find him. When Gillen is talking to the criminal about Johann being the hero, I like the shots of Lunge. The shots of Lunge are great throughout this. They're really good. And then you see Nina. I like that. This shot, even though it's in color, is really sad, of Timma with the sniper rifle. Not looking forward to anything with that at all. Also want to make note that on one page, you have Johann looking very sad. You flip the page, and Johann's in the exact same pose, looking at Timma through the scope. Terrifying. The one thing I did want to note is before Jurgens dies, whenever Gillen is talking to him, he gets the photo of Johann and he starts scribbling on it. It didn't really, I think I talked about it in the reaction a little bit, but in it, when he's talking to him, Johann takes the photo, or Jurgens takes the photograph. I need to find it and see exactly where it is. And he starts scratching out Johann from it, right? He starts scratching out Johann. Where is it at? Here it is. And when he's scratching out Johann, it almost starts to look like it's Tenma, which is creepy. Like, he starts scratching out specifically the hair like he's making it Tenma. That's creepy. Don't like it. Nope. But yeah, this whole entire volume is really, really well done. The whole thing with the kid. When they're on the rooftop and Dieter helps the kid as he's about to fall, he convinces the kid that he's actually just scared. It's not as dramatic as the anime. The anime kind of like amped it up. He just grabs him and there's not really like, he's not, because at the time, physics wise, I'm like, Dieter is not going to be able to hold the weight of a kid back. It's hard for an adult to do that. So it's not really as dramatic as it was in the anime, but it's still a tense moment. Absolutely. And then that shot of Johann with the smirk, the dimpled smirk about when he's going to die. The one thing is, the Unnamed Hero chapter, which is the last one we had, was when the guy's talking to Gillen and he explains that he's talking about why Johann would do the things that he does. Let me find that thing. He says that money, he's not interested in money. And he's talking about the line of ants, and sometimes in a parade of ants, you just want to mess with them. Like, Johann's just messing with people. He doesn't care about either way. At least that's what we're made to think, right? From Tenma and from this guy. But what's also interesting is that he says, he'll be killed by a Japanese man. He's like, is that what the children told you? And Gillen says, yes. He's like, Johann has no desire to end his life. It's hard to understand how a hero's mind works, but if there were nuclear war and everything went up in flames, Johann would survive. So yeah, so the one guy believes that Johann is not really aiming to be a martyr, although that seems to be the narrative that he's been telling people. So this volume was fantastic, just covering everything with Richard on. It's probably my favorite. Richard's story is probably my favorite side character story at this point, even though it ends horrifically sad. But it leads us to Reichwein and Gillen working together, so I guess there's that. But y'all, I've talked for nearly 15 minutes and it's just me stalling because I don't want to admit that I'm terrified about this episode. We're going to be at the halfway point after this and I don't know what to think. But I've been waiting off and holding off as long as I can. I can't hold back anymore. So there's that. So yep, I'm really excited, y'all. I'm nervous as hell, but we're all together in this. We'll be fine. Right? Of course we will. Of course we will. So we're not going to waste any more time, guys. We are going to dive into episode 36 of Monster and find out what happens. And we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1. And let's, I'll see you all on the other side. Yeah, I had a Werther's while I was writing on Whiteboard Tune here. Damn it! I should have known. I I should have known they were gonna. As I was talking to y'all at the start of this video, and I was like, we're at episode 36, which is like the halfway point. Well, next episode's the halfway point. And then in my head, I was going, I wonder if they're actually gonna wait till the halfway point to have shit go down. But all the chaos being set up in this episode, the monster of chaos, and how everything ties together. Lunge, I am just like so frustrated with Lunge. I could scream. I could scream and throw him through a screen door. But okay. I wanted to go through. I now know Obluda. Obluda. I'm glad we found that out this episode because it was going to drive me crazy what the title of that book is. Obluda is the title of the book. So maybe I should wait. Maybe I should wait a few episodes after when a volume finishes to get the volume just in case it has like something like this, because I feel like it's not really a spoiler now because how could I have known that at the end of the episode Nina would end up with the book? But the fact that this volume has Nina with the book on the cover and her up here with it, it seems like not a spoiler, but maybe just a sign that I should probably wait a few episodes after the volume's worth ends to get the volume just in case, just to be safe, right? Because I don't know if there's 7 or 9 volumes of Monster, or 8. we're near the halfway point either way. But, oh my god. So before I started this, I wanted to write on Whiteboard Coon, just writing out the concepts of the power of a name, because names have been integral to this entire series so far, right? The power of the name. You have the idea that Obluda, whatever this monster it is, Obluda sounds like Oblivion, but it's Czech. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it was I don't know if knowing what Obluda means is a spoiler or not, and I am terrified to even get on a search engine and look it up because I'm sure the first thing will pop up is monster explanation for Obluda, and I'll be like, well, I don't want that spoiler. So I'm assuming Obluda is either the name of the monster that it ends up having, or it refers to something that has to do, I don't know Czech, I cannot speak it, so I don't know. But the idea in the story so far is the monster had no name, and it wanted one so badly it went on a journey to go get one. And from the ED, we see that it like jumps from person to person trying to claim a name for itself, right? But Johann clearly reacted very negatively to the book. Nina seemed to have like a PTSD flashback of when she as a kid was saying to kill Johann. So where that's going to lead us, I don't know. I can't believe Nina was like, well, I looked everywhere and I couldn't find him. And was like, he's been in the university this whole time. Did you not check the directories? He was in the library you were at, Nina. Come on, girl. I give you a lot of credit. Mm-hmm. Nina. What's so fascinating is, for the longest time, it seemed like Johann was trying to find Nina and get a hold of her and like get with her. And now it's like he's completely abandoned his sister and even the hopes of finding her. And I'm like, what are you doing? What was that part of the plan all along? Or what's happening? So again, we know virtually nothing about the overall scope of this. We're not even to the halfway point. I should just keep asking questions. But as far as the power of the name goes, we've had a lot of characters that have had to deal with names and kind of how those names affected. And a lot of them have been affected by Johann, right? So we had Wolf. Wolf was isolated. He ended up becoming isolated and alone by Johann, known only by his name. And we know that he was tied to Kinderheim, right? And it almost seemed like Johann was isolating him out of revenge and out of, getting back at whatever Kinderheim 511 was like. That seemed to be the thing. But with Schubert, we find out with his conversation with Reichwein, which I was like, oh my God, Reichwein actually talked to him, of course. And then the worst thing was revealed. Like you expect with the parents that Johann's been staying with that have been pretending like he's their son, they were fine with living in blissful ignorance because they were like, oh, we don't care. This is what we wanted. We got what we wanted. We don't care what happens from here on in. And Reichwein's like, well, you're hopeless. And so when he finally confronts Schubert and tells him everything, we find out that Schubert, he said that he was like Johann. He was like Johann and liked to push the line of ants, suggesting that he was no better. He's like, I was a monster just like Johann, you're saying Johann is. Except now I'm old and feeble and I can't live up to the name that they gave me. He's like the vampire of Bayern. He's like, I wanted to become that monster and live up to the name. It reminded me a lot of Game of Thrones when there's a character named Tyrion in Game of Thrones who is, spoilers for Game of Thrones, it's been out for a while, but there's a character in that series who is convicted of killing his brother. And he didn't actually kill his brother by and by. He was there when it happened, but he was not responsible directly for the death of his nephew, not his brother, the death of his nephew. Well, it's a whole thing. But anyway, the character is not responsible for the death of his nephew, but when he's on trial, he tells the jury, he's like, I wish I could be the monster that you want me to be, but I'm not. And so that kind of reminded me of this, that Schubert, he wanted to become, he wasn't known by anything else, but he took on this name of the vampire Byron, and he kind of started to want to live up to his expectations. The monster grew inside of him. The idea that this darkness, the monster grew within me. But now he's too weak to live up to it. It almost makes me think that it's like the storybook. The monster's been growing inside of Schubert and it's just going to pop out of him, right? And because he can't hold it back anymore, but he can't do anything about it because he's blind and he's feeble. So he's kind of like vicariously, the fact that Schubert saw through Johann from the beginning, and he's too perfect. But he seems like, but he found that connection through Johann. Johann's a magnet. He said he was a magnet to criminals from the start. And Schubert's one of them. So of course he is. Oh my God. But it's not just Schubert either. The Red Hindenburg, Margot, we never know her real name. We just know all the nicknames she goes throughout us knowing her, right? We just know that. Roberto, he goes by Hess at one point. Is Roberto his actual name? I've called him Ricardo half the series, so we don't know much about Roberto. We don't even know if that's his real name or if it's an alias. The fact that Nina has also gone by Anna, and that we don't know if Nina's even her real name, right? And her existence has been tampered with. One thing about Nina's character at this point is that we don't really get a lot of Nina's philosophical views. She seems, in comparison to Johann, a lot more like a blank slate. We know that she was studying law. She seemed to be going to school, but then the death of her parents kind of threw all that out. So Nina's existence has been tampered with, and Nina's whole thing is she doesn't seem to really know who she is. But right now, she doesn't have time to think about that. She's too worried about tracking down Johann and also hopefully keeping Tinma from killing him, because she thinks she needs to do that. And then we have Johann and Tinma, who are fascinating in this regard, because Johann's whole thing is he says, and there's a big segment in the manga at some point where he says to her, he says to the Red Hindenburg, let me find the Red Hindenburg in this. Where is the Red Hindenburg? After he faints, yeah. He tells her, he says, I don't exist. In big letters, he says, I don't exist. There's no point. I'm no longer interested in Schewald. I'm done. So Johann doesn't want to exist. He doesn't, but that's so curious. He doesn't want to die. Obviously, he's been brought back. He doesn't want to die, but says he does not want to exist. It's like he is trying to erase any possible connection to him and become like this figment of everybody's imagination, become this illusion, this legend. And then Tinma, we find out, had the nickname Scaredy Cat Tinma. And that was a name that he didn't want. And that suddenly brings to light, not only was baby Tinma adorable, but it brings to light a lot about his character. The fact that he, had, as a kid, he was projecting this kind of cowardice by hiding, and the kids made fun of him, and we'll go back through it in the episode. But it also kind of connects to why Tinma was so apt to be kind and have this pacifist view, is that he's like, oh, I don't want to be a bully or be somebody he wanted to be liked. His whole thing about find me, he wanted people to find him and like him. So that affected how he projects himself, right? He wants to be that person. He wanted to shed the title being Scaredy Cat Tinma and being something different. So it's wanting to be noticed, Tinma wanting to be found, wanting to be noticed, and Johann wanting to disappear and wanting to hide. It's basically hide and seek. We talk about hide and seeks. Johann wants to hide and disappear. Tinma wants to be found. But it's now it's all topsy-turvy. This episode, we still got a lot more to go through, but I had to write that out to begin with. I was like, if I don't, then I'm going to regret it. So let's go through this episode. And we have the very beginning. We talk about We talk about who the kid is and him agreeing to do the operation, and he didn't know. We talk about names. He didn't know Johan's name when he operated on him, but he did it anyway. He did it anyway. And as he was saving Johan, Nina, meanwhile, was telling us, the audience, that she had to kill him. What the fudge? And that's when he disappears. And he's like, were they playing hide and seek or something? And then we cut to him on top of the bookshelf, and you can see he already has like the 5 o'clock shadow starting where he hasn't shaved. The security guard coming in and shining the light on him and nearly seeing him with it walking on is absolutely terrifying. And they say, "Scaredy cat Tenma." So what do they say here? They say, "Scaredy cat Tenma. It won't help you to hide, Scaredy cat Tenma." And they're like looking for him. And they say, if you try to hide, you'll just wet your pants again. Meanwhile, he was hiding. Poor little Tenma. He's so tiny. And like he was holding it. Had he wet his pants? Was that it? He says, how much longer are you guys going to play? And they're like, okay. And they're like, see you tomorrow. Bye. And they just left him. Oh, little baby Tenma. And he was like, what about me? And they just left. And he's in the woods alone. Everyone, I'm right here. Saying, find me. And suddenly that connects a lot to Lunge's observation in the last episode, where Lunge was like, Tenma is by himself. He's alone. So in the very interesting twist throughout this, both Tenma and Johan are alone a lot. Like, Johan doesn't really have any peers. He's alone in his quest, whatever that amounts to at this point. We've gone through like all the crazy stuff he's been doing, but he's alone in his endeavors. And Tenma is alone. And what's interesting is that both Tenma and Johan, they're both surrounded by people. Like, you have Karl and Schubert surrounding Johan. You have Dieters and Reichwein and Gillen surrounding Tenma. But both Tenma and Johan seem very isolated and detached from the people that they're with. And the people that they're with seem to have this connection with them, or think that they do. But it's like, do they really? And it's so sad, because Tenma's been such a good influence on Dieter and so many other people. And for him to be screaming, find me, and being so alone. And then Tenma like thinking back to that moment as a kid. And then saying, scaredy cat Tenma, huh? Being like, well, he's got a sniper rifle about to snipe a guy. I don't know. I kept thinking, like, I'm like, the problem is with this whole thing is that all I could think about in the moment was a lot of like serial killers or murderers had some kind of connection to an event like this happen in their past, where you go back to their past and it's like, oh, they were bullied as a kid, or oh, they were isolated as a kid. Well, damn it, that's describing Tenma, and Lunge's gonna run the hell with that if he finds out about it. I was like, Lunge. Talk about Lunge up here. Lunge and his delusions. Oh my God. If I was Gillen, I would be just... If I was Rudy Gillen, I'd be screaming and being like, are you freaking kidding me? Right here in front of you. There's everything you need to know, and you're just gonna just freaking ignore it. I'm like, And the scary thing about all of this is, that this show really makes you question whether Johan is real or not. Because so many people don't believe that he's there. Like, like, Lunge believes that Johan is still in Tenma's head. He is convinced that Johan is inside Tenma's mind. He is absolutely convinced. Like, he is certain that Tenma does not really exist. Even when there's a picture shown to him, he doesn't believe it. Or he doesn't want to believe it. And the moment when they were up on the stage, and they were like, where's Johan? Where's your assistant? And he's like, oh, he's right there. And they were like looking around. For a second, I thought there was going to be nobody there on the sidelines. I was like, oh my God, has this been all an illusion? Is Tenma making all of this up? Like, I was about to question reality. Because that's what the show makes you do. It makes you question like whether this is real or not. And you're like, hold on, what is happening? And then we have the opening, which we're going to skip past the opening. Somebody would point out that it was Nina at the beginning in the red. And I wanted to go back and check that. It is Nina. For some reason, I said that Eva was mentioned twice. She's not. It's Nina, Dieter, Eva, and Lunge. And then, yes, Johann with the monster grows inside of me. Oh my God. So yeah, let's go back. The monster of chaos. This whole episode was chaos. And now I was worried about this episode. I am 20 times more worried for next episode. 20 times more worried about it. Why did I think I was going to be fine? So what's so fascinating about this is that Schubert asks Carl to evaluate what he thinks of Reichwein because he trusts Carl's opinion. Carl's a cinnamon bun, right? And what's fascinating about this is that back when Richard was asking Reichwein, I was looking in the manga earlier today, back when Richard was asking Reichwein to evaluate Carl, he wouldn't really do it. He was like, well, what's really the point of this? And Richard was like, come on, what kind of guy do you think he is? And it's funny that we get a callback to that, only now it's Carl evaluating Reichwein and determining that Reichwein's a good guy. And so that's why Schubert agrees to see him. And I did not anticipate the conversation between Schubert and Reichwein happening the night before the ceremony. I did not anticipate. I thought that Reichwein was going to show up at the doors, like ready to see him, but no, he goes in the middle of the night to go chase down Schubert. And I was like, Reichwein, you beautiful man. I love Reichwein's character and I don't want him to die. I absolutely love his character. I don't want him to die. I am terrified of the next episode because him and Dieter are on the way to the library. Terrified, y'all. And Nina seems like she may be on her way too if that book makes her go, I gotta go back. And so what's so crazy is that like Reichwein's face whenever Schubert's like, oh, we're talking about Johann, aren't we? And Reichwein's like, oh my God, you've known this whole time that something's been off about Johann. You've known it this whole time. And you've chosen not to do anything because you see yourself in Johann. It all makes sense. It's just like the craziest thing that Schubert's known this whole time that Johann said something about him. And he's like, no, I just, I'm like, he's what I wanted to be. That's the terrifying thing. When he says that Johann is what I wanted to be. That sounds exactly like what the criminals have told Gillen for the last several volumes and the last several episodes. All the criminals are like, Johann's my hero, my unnamed hero. Again, the title Unnamed Hero, going back to names. All the criminals are like, oh, I want to be like Johann. He's my hero. And Schubert is, you think because Schubert is old, you hear how he was corrupt, before, and you don't think much of it. You're like, oh, he's this old man now. But it's kind of like Wolf. These two guys did really bad things. But the fascinating thing is that you see how he acts for Carl. And the show does this very interesting thing where you feel a little bit pitiful for Wolf by the end of it, by the end of his confrontation with Tinma. A little bit of pity. But by the end of this, up until this episode, I felt kind of bad for Schubert, and I felt like maybe he was turning things around with Carl. And when you find out that he's been a bad person this whole time, kind of, but then how do we describe that? Because he is kind to Carl and making an effort with him. It's like it calls everything into question, right? And it begs the question, because Johann was trying to tell Richard, he's like, did that kid deserve to die? Was he proven guilty? And this idea of Schubert being like, I know I was a bad person, and Johann's trying to be what I could never become or what I wanted to be, but Schubert's not evil necessarily. So that's the interesting thing, is that Richard described the Hess boy as having evil inside of him. We've seen Johann described as having evil, with like having the essence of evil. I don't think that's been described with Schubert, right? I don't think Schubert's on that. He wanted to be like Johann. He wanted to be the essence of evil, but I don't think he was. And he's like, someday it seemed like you would come to solve the mystery. He's just too perfect. But I can feel it. Like he doesn't really exist. Yeah, there's that idea that Johann being too perfect. being too perfect that it doesn't seem like he's real. He seems like a legend. And I love that Raikkone's like, I can assure you he's real. Here's the receipts of what he did. I love that Raikkonen is fueled. Raikkonen is an interesting character because he's fueled by revenge. He's fueled by wanting to avenge Richard. But the way that Raikkonen goes about it as a character, I really find endearing because, you know, most people when they go on like, you know, vengeful vendettas for their fallen friends, they act in like rage and violence and they get all like just extremely high energy. And Raikkonen's not like that. Raikkonen's like very calm and collected and put together about it, but he knows he has a mission. And I find that fascinating. And then he tells Dieter, he's like, well, I'm an ex-cop, you know, turned doctor, so have to do something. And I love when he pulled out the packet to show that Johann's not an illusion. For a second, I thought he was going to hand the packet to Schubert and be like, read this. And Schubert was just going to stare at it and be like, really? But he says the story begins when a young boy was fatally wounded and taken to a hospital in 1986. Oh my God. So yeah. And then he's like, and then he showed up in front of you. But you can tell he's still after revenge because he's like, the fallen, no murdered Richard. And then talks about him controlling Farron. He's like, why in these last few years, do you know how many people have died around you? So yeah, he points out all the people that mysteriously died. And it seems like just like with Wolf, Johann's been isolating him, right? Just messing with him. But Schubert is fine with it. He's like, well, I would have done the same thing. And it's like, oh my God. Also, there's this idea, we need to talk about this, that Schubert has been giving away possessions. Usually that's a sign, that's not a good sign. Usually if somebody thinks they're going to die or they're about to commit suicide, they start giving away possessions. That's like a telltale red flag. He also sends Carl to get the document. He sends him like last minute to go get this document at his study, knowing that it will take a long time for him to be gone. I'm like, why is the document that important? I mean, I'm assuming that document is it what Raikkonen gave him? I hope he made copies. I mean, did Raikkonen give it him? Is it that document? But I'm fully convinced he sent Carl away to get the document so he wouldn't be there if he died, so that Carl wouldn't have to witness it. I am fully convinced that Schubert believes he's going to die, but I'm like, Schubert is nowhere near Johann. So Johann's off in the corner awkwardly clapping, which we'll talk about that when we get to it. But I'm like, if Tinma fires the gun at Johann, Schubert's probably not going to die because they're nowhere near the line of fire. So why did Schubert think he was going to die? Is Schubert going to commit suicide and they're going to blame it on Tinma? I don't know, because Lunge is fully in belief that Tinma has gone to that depository to kill Schubert because he doesn't believe Johann's real. And I was like, damn it. And that's when he's like, he wanted to get close to you. And then he's like, you told me Johann played with people like he played with an antlion. He said, they called me the vampire Byron. I took that name with pride. And I took the role to its logical conclusion. I don't know how, but it became bigger and bigger. And it's the idea that that our names attach to our persona of how we present ourselves to be. And in his case, we talk about the ego. It attaches to his ego of his identity. Because yeah, if people, for example, if you get called a bitch a lot, for example, then you can either do one of two things. You can either like retroactively try to act in a way that would be the opposite of that, or you could do like Schubert and take pride in that and be like, fine, you want to call me a bitch, I'll be a bitch. And then just make it bigger and bigger until it becomes ingrained and becomes who you are. And that's essentially what Schubert's done. He became the vampire Bayern because the monster inside him grew. And it's like, yep, that seems exactly like what the storybook's describing, what's happening here. And the monster inside me grew. And that's why I don't want Tinma to kill him. I don't want this monster to grow inside Tinma. I don't want it to be like that. I want Tinma to be fine. I want Tinma to stay away from that, to stop it. No. And I like that Raikkonen's just like looking at him like, okay. He says, but what about now? The nickname is imposing, but I'm so weak. I wanted to play with the antlion. He's going to become what I wanted to be. Who can become like that monster? Who can challenge and fight that monster? So, hi Attack on Titan. Nice to see you. Great to have you back in the discussion. We talk about that to fight a monster, according to Schubert, I'm going to tie this over here, you need to be a bigger monster. Which, if you've watched my Attack on Titan reactions and discussions, you know that formulaic line is problematic to me for lots of reasons, because it does not beget itself. Two wrongs don't make a right, right? But essentially, you could look at it in a number of different ways. You could look at it as maybe Johann is trying, but here's the thing that's kind of funny about all this, is because Johann is interesting in that Johann is framed by others as not caring about people. He's described as not caring about people, an agent of chaos, and unafraid to kill. That's how Johann has been, somewhat described. But then we see that he's all about this child's Bill of Rights and standing up for defending the orphans at Kinderheim, who he supposedly sat on a throne and watched kill each other, but that's beside the point. And then he's been influencing children. Lots of stuff with kids. Lots of stuff with Johann and the kids. But that seems to be in direct contrast to the not caring about people, agents of chaos, and unafraid to kill. There is connections between the agent of chaos and the children, because looking back at the manga, the kids were talking about how they are the special chosen ones if they can stare death in the face and live through it, kind of like what Johann's done. Same deal, right? So that there is something there. I'm not saying there's not. But if for him caring about the children's bill and standing up for Hess against Richard, that kind of contradicts the whole he doesn't care about people, right? So there's some contradiction there to work with. But I was wondering, does it mean one? The obvious conclusion by that statement is say that Tenma must become a bigger monster than Johann to stop Johann, which we know isn't going to work, because the monsters becoming bigger, they just pop out and go to another person. The violence begets violence. The cycle continues. It doesn't stop the cycle. So it's not going to work. But I also thought it could refer to Johann becoming a bigger monster than the monster that he grew up with. Like Johann thinking, well, if I'm going to enact change to help these kids in the future, I have to become the monster to stop the monstrous system itself. And then Johann thinks that he has to become a bigger monster to stop Johann. And again, it's just a cycle. It just keeps going like the storybook. So I have a lot of issues with that line of thinking. But as soon as he said that, I was like, well, hello, Attack on Titan. I see you, Armin. Everything going all right? And I love Reichwein's is that Johann's silent power? The only thing that can beat this monster is a bigger monster. And then there we go. And Reichwein's just like, well, that was interesting. Now, Carl wanted to cancel the ceremony to let his dad rest. And I was like, that would have been a great idea if you'd gone through with that. But they don't end up doing that. Johann went straight from East Hohen office to the ceremony hall. And so then we have Nina. We have the vision of Nina telling Tenma that it wasn't his fault. It was his duty as a doctor to save people. And as Tenma's, having this dream about her telling him to save people, he's planning on killing Johann and sniping him. And so then Nina quits the job. She just hasn't found Johann. And she's getting ready to go. And that's when Tenma's lining up his sights and Schubert shows up. Now, this whole scene of Schubert walking in is really sad because, one, it reminds me of Neon Genesis. Everybody's like, congratulations. But also, it's so fake. Like, everybody's talking behind his back when he shows up, and they're like, oh, it's the vampire Bayard. Oh, don't say it too loud. Oh, we need him to stay alive longer for our companies and the profits. Like, they're all so greedy and vain and self-centered. They don't really care about Schubert. They just care about the money and the power he has. And Schubert, I think, knows that. I think after this episode, I'm like, Schubert's a lot more aware of things than we thought he was. So yeah, he's there. And like, he rarely appears in public, so lots of people came, but he's giving away his keepsakes. He's an important piece of the European economy. We need him. Yeah, so again, the monster of chaos. You have all these people saying how much they need Schubert, they need him to stay alive, and Schubert's like, well, then I'll just die and make this all chaotic. And I'm like, well, no wonder what's happening. So the idea that they talk about the people using him, which is fascinating, because you have Schubert and the people saying that they need him to stay alive. And oddly enough, that reminds me of when Tenma's been going to all these villages, and the people are like, oh, don't leave, we need you as the doctor, we need you, right? They don't really care. They didn't really necessarily care about Tenma as a person, but they cared about his services that he provided. Kind of like they care about Schubert, not as Schubert as a person, but Schubert for the services he provides. Kind of going back to the doctor a few episodes ago, where the clinic, they needed her for her services that she provided. So there's this interesting correlation between Schubert and Tenma of them being needed for their service, but they're not actually cared for as a person. It's their title, the title they have that's important. It's so fascinating. I'm like, yes, please. And then he mysteriously sends Carl to go get the document on top of his desk. And I'm like, he's like, oh, Johann will be here soon. I'm like, no, Schubert's going to be dead by the end of next episode. That's the last time Carl's going to see him alive. I'm like, oh my God. And then we cut to Lunge. And again, I feel for Rudy. I'm like, if I was Rudy, I would be banging my head against a wall and just like throwing everything in my office and being like, are you freaking kidding me? Because Rudy's like, I gave you his photo. I told you he was going to Munich. What the fudge are we doing, Lunge? And Lunge is like, everything's going smoothly. He's like, I thought you were going to help us out. And Lunge's like, no. That's why I told you Tenma was in Munich. What are you doing? And Gilbert's like, did you investigate Schubert's secretary, Johann? There's no doubt he's the real killer. Like, we've told you everything. I gave you my manifesto. He's like, are you listening? If you don't hurry up and arrest him, Tenma's going to try and end this by himself. And I'm like, that is exactly what Lunge is planning on. Lunge wants to be proven right. He wants to be correct. And the manga with Lunge and Rudy actually has a really good part in it. There's a really good part in it. I need to find out that conversation that they have, where he talks about the hands, right? He talks about the hands and how it's betraying himself because it's all subjective. And then that's where he says, he's like, that's how you've worked all these years, isn't it? The information you input with your hands of yours is correct. Your judgments are infallible. He says, do you have a family? Any hobbies? No, you only live for your work, don't you? Have you ever been wrong? You're terrified of being wrong, aren't you? That's why Dr. Tenma has to be evil. Otherwise, your whole identity is threatened. Face the facts. This is a photograph of Johann Liebert. Can you prove that all of Tenma's claims are false? So yeah, I mean, Rudy gets to, like, he reads them really good. He's like, Lunge's entire existence, his name, his identity, the monster inside Lunge is all dependent upon if he's right or not. And if he can't be right, then he doesn't exist. So it does not exist. It's all coming together. And so, so Lunge wants to be correct. He has to be correct, right? So his whole thing is that he, I'm sure, wants to frame Tenma or catch Tenma. And he knows that he has a sniper rifle, which is absolutely terrifying. And he thinks that he's going to kill Schubert to cause chaos. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, no. My fear is, what if something happens and Tenma accidentally shoots Schubert somehow? I don't know how that's going to happen when Johann's on the other side of the building. It should be like stormtroopers could not miss that line of fire, but damn it, I don't know. He's like, Tenma's going to try to end this by himself if you don't do something. And that's when Lunge, he says, don't worry, the investigation's going smoothly. It's exactly how I want it to go. It's like, what the fudge? And Gillen's like, are you kidding me? He says, excuse me. And he's like, Johann is right in front of our eyes. And then that Lunge is like, as expected from a criminal psychiatrist. That is a good description. Johann does exist, undoubtedly. And then he shuts the door. And then when he says Johann does exist inside Tenma's head, and I'm like, you son of a bitch, no! As he's going about the information. It's just like, and they find out it's a sniper rifle. They've been interrogating him the whole time. And that's when he's like, I am Tenma. I love the man's expression when he's like, I am Tenma. And the guard is just like, why did I expect anything else? I really do think that, I don't know if Lunge is on a spectrum of any state, but he does strike me as somebody that is. He's on a spectrum. And that's not a bad thing. It's just a character description of it because of just how specific there are little idiosyncrasies about him that I'm like, Lunge. But I'm just like, why can't you just believe him? He's like, I've got this sniper rifle. And he's like, I am Tenma. And I am Johann. He's like, who would I shoot with these hands? I killed the hospital directors. I killed these middle-aged couples. I love chaos. And that's when he figures out Schubert. I'm like, son of a bitch. I'm like, the problem is Lunge is great at reading Johann so far and figuring things out. But I'm like, why are you thinking they're the same person? Stop it. So I knock White Work Coon over. So I love that Reichwein constantly tells us little things about himself. Like, when I was a doctor for the National Border Control, and I was a former ex-cop turned doctor. I'm like, look at you. Look at you, sweetheart. He's like, I'll save your friend. No matter what. And Dieter's like, and that's when I always don't underestimate a doctor who's an ex-cop. And then that's when we see the idea of the book ceremony, and that's when he gets the idea of going to it. And Dieter, of course, Dieter doesn't listen. He follows him. I'm like, they're all going. Nina's probably going to show back up at the book thing. Reichwein and Dieter are on the way. Lunge's on the way. Gillen's probably going to go. Schubert's already there. Carl's going to be the only one not there, and it's because Schubert didn't want to see him get killed. But I'm like, what the fudge? And he's like, we have to go. And then they wheel him up there. This is the part I kind of question whether Johann was even there. They're like, oh yeah, he's right over there. But the question is, are they, there is something weird about that though, where they're like, Johann, they're like, your secretary. Because when he asks, where's our secretary? And they go, what? Secretary? A part of me felt like, is he real? Is the secretary real? Are they just humoring him? And like saying, oh yeah, he's right over there when he's really not there, when they don't see him at all, right? Because why would Johann be standing way over there by the other side of the bookshelves? Why is he standing off to the side? Why? It's the most bizarre thing. And it makes you question, has Johann just been a figment of all these people's imaginations? Is it just like a weird virus? I'm like, what is happening? Because, yeah, it's so bizarre to see Johann just standing out to the side like that. Like, very off-putting to see him so far away. He's like, it's so weird. And then just zooms in on Johann. It's creepy. Where he's just like, the creepiest thing in the world. I'm like, what the fudge? And then Tenma's like, oh, there's Johann. Now, part of me was wondering, like, okay, Johann's standing off by himself. If Johann expects to be killed, is he doing that so that people don't get injured too, like in the blast, because he's away from everybody? I mean, if he was standing next to Schubert, and the other men, there's a chance that Tenma would not shoot because it'd be a liability. It could possibly hurt the people surrounding him. So him standing off by himself is the perfect, like, I'm right here, Tenma. If you're going to shoot, shoot now moment. Where I'm like, what the fudge? And then he looks up and there he is. Just like waiting on him. And he says, I was the one who saved his life. I was the one who saved that monster. And then that's when Lottie shows up to get to Nina and says, you guys are twins, aren't you? I saw this, and he's like, he saw this and suddenly fainted. And so we see a little boy on the back of it, which is weird. A little boy. And then she turns it around and says, it says, Obluda, Kira Nima Zve Jimeno. I wonder if I could just pull up Google Translate. Can it let me do that? I'm going to do Google Translate because that seems like it will be the least spoilery. Google Translate. And if I can do a check. Can I find check on here? Surely I can. I can. It does let me do check. Obluda. Monster. Okay. Obluda is monster. How fitting. And it says Kira Nima Sve Jimeno. So... okay, so Bluda is monster. That's great. Kira. Let me find out what it says there. Bluda. Kira, Nima, Sve, and then Jimeno. Or is it Kura? Maybe try Kura instead of Kira. Kura. Well, Kura says a bitch doesn't have a name. Kura Nimasvejmino means a bitch doesn't have a name. That doesn't seem right. What? Maybe try something else. Kira. Kira doesn't have a full name. Was it? Maybe Clara. Maybe Clara. Clara doesn't have a full name. Quera. I'm just going to go with a bitch doesn't have a name. Monster, a bitch doesn't have a name. Okay. But it says the title of the book is called Monster, Something Doesn't Have a Name. Well, that's creepy. I got like goosebumps at that. That's absolutely amazing, actually. Okay. Yeah. Doesn't know whatever it is. And then we see like the little monster on the front of it. Yep. And then that's when, and Nina's eye starting to twitch is just the freakiest thing. Like, what is happening? She clearly hasn't read Czech in a long time. So seeing this is like, what is even happening? And why is she like walking in this trance state to the hospital? It goes back to that moment where she's like walking creepily, saying that she has to kill him. What is even going on? I don't even know. Nope. So yeah. I have a lot to think about. I am really excited that I got volume 4. But the idea of a name, the idea that Schubert is on to Johann and doesn't care, the idea that Lunge is headed that way, and it's like, what do we even do? The idea that Tenma, is he gonna kill Johann or not? We don't know. And Nina in the book, Obluda, the monster. A bitch has no name. I really hope that's the title. But yes, I'm very curious to see what's gonna happen next in part 2. The funny thing is, if I had watched this series, people at the beginning were like, oh, you should watch 2 episodes at a time. I was like, no, this is too much. I've already got like nearly an hour of discussion already. It would have not made a difference because this was episode 36. So it would have been 1, 2, 3, 4. It would have ended on this episode and then I would have had to wait till next week anyway. So it wouldn't have mattered. Oh my God. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts down below. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yes, I'll be back very soon with episode 37 of Monster. Halfway point, y'all. See you then.